governance, local councils, is Assia Mihi. She wrote a chapter called Governance from Below, comparing local experiments in Egypt and Syria after the uprisings, really looking at local councils that sprung up fairly organically in the wake of either state failure or the sort of withering of state authority. Assia is a governance and public administration officer at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, although here today only in her personal capacity and not her official capacity. And Assia has a PhD in comparative politics from the University of Toronto and was a visiting scholar at Cal Berkeley. I'm also joined by two of my Century colleagues, Sam Heller, who wrote a chapter called Keeping the Lights On in Rebel Idlib, Local Governance Services and the Competition for Legitimacy Among Islamist Armed Groups, and he's Beirut-based. My other colleague, Aaron Lund, who's also a fellow at the Century Foundation, and wrote a chapter called Into the Tunnels, the Rise and Fall of Syria's Rebel Enclave in the Eastern Ghouta. And he represents the sort of Stockholm office of the Century Foundation. So with that, all of these chapters are looking at the kinds of local governance and administration that have arisen in some of the vacuums that were afforded local actors, in this case, in Egypt and Syria, and in the latter two chapters in specific parts of Syria. And so, and in keeping with the kind of theme of agnosticism, I'm going to turn to Assia first, because the stories that come out of the local councils are instructive and important, but not necessarily ones where we draw positive lessons. In some of these cases, we have the real limitations of some of these very organic processes are laid bare. And so maybe if you could start us out with a bit of discussion about kind of broad overview, your conclusions about this experiment, these experiments in local governance.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm very pleased to be here. The focus of my chapter was on comparing two sets of experiences, one coming out of Egypt, which is represented by Al-Lijan al-Sha'biyya, local popular committees, mainly in informal areas. And the other experience, which is slightly different but also quite interesting, is that of the local administrative councils in Syria, which also my colleagues are also going to be talking about later on today. What is interesting about these two experiments is that they represented new modes of grassroots organizing that are unprecedented for the region. They were spontaneous, autonomous, voluntary forms of organizing that emerged in the wake of power vacuums. These power vacuums, of course, varied. So in Egypt, it was the relative disappearance of the state's authority, while in Syria, clearly the state was retreating from administering certain territories. And what emerged from my comparison of the two experiments is that we were seeing new forms of local organizing emerging. The grassroots were moving beyond merely survival tactics, what other scholars have typically cast in terms of quiet encroachment, for instance, by the masses, to start to engage in more sophisticated collective forms of organizing. And this in itself was driven by practical needs as well as normative commitment to democratic change on the ground. So they wanted to bring about more participatory practices of citizenship to the localities, to the communities where they were based. But looking closely at the records of what actually transpired, it was very clear that there are serious democratic deficits in what happened. So yes, they were very promising. And yes, they represent something very significant, I think, in the trajectory of the development of the post-colonial state in the Arab region. And yet, they fall short in terms of inclusion. There were serious gaps when it came to representation of women among both the local committees in Egypt as well as the local administrative councils in Syria. The marginalization of the poor was also quite prevalent, so they were predominantly led by youth who belonged to the middle class, who were educated, relatively affluent. There were problems in terms of democratic decision-making, transparency, internal decision-making was not always participatory or based on democratic principles. External accountability and embeddedness in their communities, their ability to engage back and forth with the community to identify local needs and so on, that was also not going in the most democratic way. And of course, the potential for long-term institutionalization of these experiments looked quite weak, even early on in these experiences. And perhaps later on, we can get back to where these experiments are. But definitely there was a lack of vision in terms of what comes next and how to sustain it and how to mobilize resources to keep these experiments going. So to get back to the question, and I hope I didn't detract too much from the focus, yes, a very positive development that answers a lot of questions that scholars have grappled with about whether there is a civil society, whether there is willingness to participate and to manage the affairs of one's communities, and yet serious shortcomings when it comes to looking at the actual record as far as inclusion and transparency and so on.
Well, you talked about the willingness to sort of enter into that vacuum. In the case of Egypt, it happened very quickly. Could you maybe just give a brief, a brief synopsis of how that process happened? Because it really arose, really in that 3-week period, all of a sudden something was happening, and that the kind of speed with which it happened, I think, caught people somewhat off guard.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the beginning of the Lijan Sha'biya, the local popular committees, was basically due to the fact that the police had disappeared from the streets. So people needed to protect property to bring back some sense of safety and order to their communities. And as the state re-emerged and as order was restored gradually, many of these committees basically disappeared. They ceased to function. There was no, the raison d'être for the emergence had basically disappeared. But in the informal settlements that I studied across Giza, something interesting was happening. These committees, which were initially formed just to protect, property, night watch brigades or whatever, were becoming engaged in community development causes. They were organizing to claim access to services from the state, to transform their neighborhoods, to bring about long-sought changes to their communities. So it was a process of change, going from a simple protection of property to more involvement in local activism and community development concerns.
So, Sam, Essia mentions mobilizing resources, and of course in your chapter on Idlib, we have a kind of very granular case study of how the mobilizing resources and the competition among often sort of clashing rebel factions played out over time. Again, can you give a bit, sort of a brief overview of how these dynamics interacted, how social service provision became an important sort of imprimatur of legitimacy for these various groups?
So I'd say that in the case of Idlib, it seems like there were a number of motivations at work for the various service actors, from civilians to armed groups. But certainly access and control of resources and what that meant in terms of political power and influence, I think, was a main one. First, I mean, just to caveat this, so in researching Syria's northwest Idlib province, there are obvious major challenges in terms of access. So when I researched this, then it was done using, I have not been able to kind of safely enter Idlib, but I spoke remotely with people inside, and then I interviewed various people in neighboring Turkey. So that includes representatives of local councils, activists, representatives of armed groups, representatives of armed group-linked service bodies, Western development officials, relief officials. So that was how, to the best of my ability, I tried to put together a picture of the kind of service governance scene inside the province. Which, I mean, at this point, and like most other areas, I think, that have now fallen outside the control of the Assad regime, the service governance scene is dominated by these local administrative councils, which serve a number of purposes. So they are, critically, they are conduits for outside assistance. They also provide some low level of municipal services, including, let's see, trash removal, road repair, kind of utilities repairs. And they've also been an experiment in many of these areas in participatory governance, which I think has taken a number of different forms. Nominally, these kind of local town or city level councils have been part of something bigger, of a superstructure that in Idlib would in theory include the Idlib Provincial Council, which is a sort of opposition replacement for the regime's old muhafazat, which again in theory would link up to the opposition shadow government, the Syrian interim government. But in practice, that seems not to have really been the case. Instead of what would have been kind of a more comprehensible vertical hierarchy of these institutions, what you have is a set of more kind of atomized, disconnected local councils that are linked, or for which the kind of the relationships of power and control go outwards in an array of different directions. Primarily to what's called with the catch-all term Mobilizing. So that's organizations, and that's inclusive of NGOs, stabilization contractors or implementers, various charities, for most of which the local councils are the preferred, approved, and kind of reliable partner to deliver and implement their programming on the ground. But also you have other actors who have stepped in. So in many areas, particularly it sounds like in more rural areas, you have powerful families, and you also have to some extent armed factions, which are themselves rooted in these areas and these families. So they're not wholly separate from this scene. So what you end up with councils that are simultaneously, in many areas, relatively weak, but hugely important in terms of access to these resources and to local power. Because if you can provide assistance, if you can direct it and select the recipients, then that is authority. So across the province, it seems like you had a kind of a turning point in 2015, which is when an alliance of local or Islamist and jihadist factions swept down through the province, captured the provincial capital, Idlib city, and then almost entirely expelled the regime from Idlib province. At that point, the two leading components of that alliance turned towards governance and services, towards trying to dictate the order, the political order of this province. So these two main actors, you had Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syria's acknowledged al-Qaeda affiliate. It's now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And you had Harakat Ahrar al-Sham, al-Islamiyya, sorry, so, or just Ahrar al-Sham, which is it's an Islamist movement that emerged from a more militant milieu, but subsequently took on a more kind of populist, populist revolutionary character. So as they did this, they collaborated jointly, these two factions in particular, in setting up a service administration in Idlib city and a few other areas, which was essentially a factional set of structures that were bolted onto existing service bodies. But in the countryside, they went at each other much more directly. And they competed through a set of linked or backed service institutions that attempted to kind of capture loyalty and control on the local level. And they did it different ways. So Ahrar al-Sham, what they did is they tried to kind of connect, coordinate the existing local councils, and in that way to tap into these existing modes of international support. Whereas Jabhat al-Nusra, they did a lot more kind of their own direct service provision. In some instances, they displaced councils. They also seized key nodes of the of infrastructure that they could control and maintain. So particularly electricity. They were responding in a lot of cases to systemic dysfunction. To failure by some of these councils. And so the idea was that they would step in, they would rationalize things, they would make things make sense. But also this was a means of accruing influence and power. In some instances, it seems to have been a tool to secure revenues. Certainly the Nusra body has now kind of pivoted towards revenue seeking from local communities. And it was also another space for the factional competition between these two leading factions that has also taken place in other spaces. So they just migrated into the service space. But ultimately, what you had was with the armed group actors, with the civilians, nearly everyone has fallen short. Just because they're facing essentially an impossible challenge of standing up functional, normal governance in like a profoundly abnormal environment. So between the regime's aerial bombing, which has prevented kind of any sort of normalcy or maturation of these structures, trends of localism, factionalism, unreliable or arbitrary streams of external support, very limited resources, whether material or human. Nobody has been able to surmount these challenges. So what we've seen since the paper is that the joint administration in Idlib city has by now, at least nominally, surrendered control of Idlib city to a civilian local council, which is something that was, I think, read as an admission of defeat by these factions, that they were unable to provide for this area without access to kind of more expansive, generous external support. But Nusra and Ahrar, or now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they've continued competing in the countryside. And when we've seen, so we've actually seen this play out recently, when each of the two factions, or the service institutions that are linked or linked to or backed by them, they have each, by their own admission, cut electricity supplies either to the entirety of Idlib province or to specific areas because of a dispute over control of Idlib, of electricity coming from regime areas. And then a dispute over the fair pricing of it. So the competition is still ongoing. And then even as you've seen kind of a broader de-escalation up and down the west of the country, these factions have turned inwards, and then they're still going at each other, but just with now its services. And then ultimately, so what you have is a service picture, a scene that has never really cohered into a political alternative. These town-level bodies were, in many senses, they were meant to function as the building blocks, the foundation of an alternate system that would ultimately replace or supplant the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But they never came together. And then now, because you have this adversarial relationship, because they're part of a conflict that is by now existential, then as the regime marches forward and retakes more of this territory, then it's actually very difficult to imagine a future for really any of these institutions.
So, Aaron, Sam mentions sort of abnormal circumstances, and Ghouta is certainly that. And in fact, those circumstances have changed for the worse for all of these rebel groups over time. And control of the tunnels becomes in some ways their primary purpose. And that competition over the sort of fact of governance or any kind of administration, those things seem to fall by the wayside. And it's this competition for the tunnels which become the kind of lifeblood, the lifeline for sustainability that comes to the fore. Do you think that's an accurate, fair representation? And what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, first to just the Ghouta region east of Damascus it's been under siege for since 2013, early 2013, and that was the reason I started looking into this area, because I figured it could be, since it was cut off from the rest of Syria, and the groups that dominated that area were not the same groups that sort of had national, like the groups that Sam mentions, Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra. They were present in the Ghouta as well, but they were not the top contenders for power there. So you had a kind of an isolated enclave with cut off in terms of, I mean, they were not able to move in or out. They were not able to get guns in easily, at least. And the Syrian regime, which controlled the perimeter of this territory and controlled Damascus, the capital, would also regulate, sometimes more, sometimes less, how much food and medicine and other things would come in, generally very little. So in this area, as Michael describes, you had a situation where, for the rebel groups, as they competed with each other and also sought to build up their military capacity and their governance capacity and their political sort of cohesion, often through client networks by co-opting smaller groups that were active in maybe a single neighborhood or a single village. They needed to control the sort of the bottlenecks of smuggling, the revenue sources, and those revenue sources were as in the title of the chapter, the tunnels. And there was also, there still is, a crossing, sort of an official entry point for goods into the eastern Ghouta, despite the fact that it is under siege, and that's located close to the Wafidin refugee camp, or the Wafidin camp, close to Douma, which is the biggest city in the eastern Ghouta. That's an area dominated by the Islam Army, or Jaish al-Islam, which is the biggest group, or at least was the biggest group in that region by a long shot for a while. So it's a long and very complicated story, and I hope you take the time to read the chapter, because I think at least it's a fascinating story as well. But much of the politics in this area played out first around who should control that crossing, because if you control the crossing, that meant that when the regime allowed goods through or allowed traders to work in that crossing, bring in goods, you have to bribe first checkpoints on the regime side, and then you had to bribe checkpoints on the rebel side, or pay a fee, or whatever they call it. Goods would come into the Ghouta, they would be hideously overpriced, contributing to civilian suffering, but also feeding the actors of the violent actors in the war. So there was, in 2014, you had some pretty violent fighting between that group I just mentioned, the Islam Army, led by Zahran Aloush at that time, a local Salafi guy from Douma, and another group which was basically put together by minor Free Syrian Army factions and local gangs and smugglers and the odd Islamist group here and there. And their sort of, the thing that kept them together was, they called themselves the Ummah Army at the time. The thing that held them together was that they were opposed to Zahran Aloush, to the Islam Army, and to its attempts to gain hegemony of the whole of the Ghouta. So they fought over that crossing. Zahran came out on top, and from 2014 on, starting earlier that summer and ending in spring 2015, when the Islam Army's influence sort of peaked, Zahran Aloush, this Islamist leader, was able to draw on the resources from that crossing, on the fact that his group had built up a pretty solid organization with a secret police and other things he'd basically copied off of the regime to use. There was a prison, there still is a prison called the Toba prison, the repentance prison, where you end up if you criticize the leadership of the Islam Army too loudly. So there was some tough policing, and there was control over the resources, and there was a driving sort of ideological force to this group. And that brought the Islam Army into power in much of the Ghouta. But as we've seen elsewhere in Syria, whenever you have someone dominating or getting closer to dominance, that tends to provoke a counter-reaction. And in the Ghouta, that took the same form as almost everywhere else, just in I'd say an enhanced or accelerated way because of the siege that sort of cut these groups off from each other, and it forced all the other groups in the area to basically join forces to oppose Zahran Aloush. And step by step, you saw polarization between, initially, you might have had 30 groups in that area, and then eventually you had 5 groups, and then you had 3 big groups, and then today there's basically two or 2.5, I'd say. So the problem for Zahran Aloush was that this crossing, the Wafidin camp crossing that he had control over, was not the only source of income and revenue and influence in the eastern Ghouta. There was also the tunnels, and the tunnels stretched in the sort of the western edges of the Ghouta enclave. In these, that means the sort of the eastern suburbs of Damascus, Barzeh and Harasta and these places, where there's fighting right now as well, Jobar and Aintab and these places. So those tunnels came to be because just outside of the eastern Ghouta, the perimeter of that enclave that was under siege, the regime had in 2014, early 2014, struck deals with two other neighborhoods, Barzeh and Qaboun, both of which have now been retaken by the regime. And since those neighborhoods sort of control their own affairs, there was a ceasefire, kind of a brittle ceasefire, so there's fighting from time to time. But they control their own affairs, and they were able to trade with Damascus City and go in and out with certain limitations. They could bring in goods by bribing officers or making deals with officers that were interested in seeing this go in. And then they could go, just dig a tunnel into the Ghouta, under the front line, and send stuff through. And the regime kind of knew this. It exploited it, whether that was because of economic corruption, financial corruption, or because they wanted to preserve the ceasefires, didn't want to upset anything with the rebel groups there, or whether it was because they were actively sending in stuff to certain groups in order to support them against other groups, playing these groups off against each other, as many people have hinted to me, though there's precious little evidence. So there were different reasons for this. And the fight, when the Islam Army had taken the tunnels in late 2014, the Wafidin crossing in late 2014, early 2015, the fight began to focus on the tunnels, because if Zahran al-Aloush, as the Islam Army leader, wanted complete control over the Ghouta, he needed sort of complete control over this bottled up economy, and which would give him control over the client networks and an ability to sort of reward and punish factions as he pleased. And that's where the other factions basically put in they resisted that. There was a lot of fighting around these tunnels, and eventually you had on Christmas Day 2015, Zahran al-Aloush was killed by a missile fired either by the Syrian Air Force or the Russian Air Force, we don't really know. And his disappearance led to, well, basically all the other factions saw their chance. The leader of the Eastern Ghouta was gone, and it was time to sort of gang up on the Islam Army, and very quickly then you had rising polarization and conflict in the Eastern Ghouta over spring 2016, and April, May, you saw an offensive by all the other groups that had ganged up into alliances. They went after the Islam Army, took the tunnels away from the Islam Army, those that they controlled. And since then, the Ghouta has basically been split between these two blocks, the Islam Army and their opponents, who each control one source of revenue and are increasingly sort of distancing themselves from each other, and there's a lot of bad blood between these factions now, increasingly religious differences, and they're all Islamist to some extent, but different schools of Islamism, and personal differences, and many other things have crept into that by now. So now you have essentially an enclave that's divided into two enclaves internally, and the regime has, of course, used this. They fought first the Islam Army without attacking the other areas, and took a large area of the enclave on the southern and the eastern ends in 2016, and then you had a renewed bout of fighting today, a year later, in April, May this year. And the regime has used this as well. Now they're going after the other faction. So step by step, this is the rise and fall of the Eastern Ghouta enclave, which was once one of Syria's most important rebel areas. It's now contained and sort of neutralized by the regime, and eventually it will fall to the regime. There's no question about it. So yeah.
All these examples of local governance and administration have shrunk. I mean, the Ligan al-Sha'biya don't really function anymore in Egypt in any real sense. Idlib is rural and isolated. Ghouta is shrinking and will eventually fall, as you say. But alongside this, in parallel, we have other kinds of local governance springing up. We have the Kurdish example with the SDF in Syria. There might be potential for local governance in the south of Syria, depending on how or if the de-escalation process happens, and whether it becomes a political as opposed to simply a military endeavor. we have now, I think, particularly post-Mosul, we have this question looming over governance in Iraq. So I wonder for all of you, what are these parallel processes look like? Are there lessons to be learned from what has happened in these other cases? Are they too constrained by wartime conditions to extrapolate from that experience? Or do they offer any kind of lesson about what happens in the future in local governance elsewhere? Assia, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think if we relate the experiments, the local experiments of the popular committees and the LACs in Syria to the rather different context of Iraq, it's quite interesting actually to consider the possibilities for grassroots-driven decentralization in Iraq at this moment. So I think, yes, there are some lessons probably to be drawn looking at some of the successes and failures coming from these experiments. When looking at, to what extent the ongoing momentum towards further decentralization in Iraq, if it's going to take root and transform the prevailing social contract and the state structure. I think the situation in Iraq is also a bit different in that the restructuring of the state has happened top-down so far, and it has come with a great deal of political liability, basically. It is subject to a lot of power competition between various forces, those that are very resistant to change and others that see the future of the polity that is more decentralized and more embracing of diversity and so on. But there is a disjuncture. The legal institutional reforms that have happened in Iraq and have opened some spaces for decentralization of public services have been driven by certain elites and certain interests, and it's happened top-down. The local efforts, the grassroots efforts to self-manage, to develop similar experiences to what we have seen in Egypt and Syria have not quite matched with the spaces. So we need to think about what kinds of parameters are governing the grassroots in Iraq. So the NGO law, the capacity of the various communities to self-organize, the spaces that will be provided for them, particularly in liberated areas, so they can actually make decentralization a real project in Iraq, as opposed to just a legal institutional kind of restructuring that has not quite lived up to a fully decentralized state. And maybe later on I can come back with more thoughts, but that's in terms of linking what I've studied to the Iraqi case.
So on those two specific Syrian cases, so I've done less first-hand investigation of either the south or the Kurdish areas. My understanding is that the south has roughly been organized as kind of an opposition-held area, albeit one on the other end of the country and with very different kind of political military dynamics. That the local council, provincial council model, that it has been kind of roughly similar to the north and to how that was organized. As for its prospects, I think it's unclear, in part because the shape of the de-escalation, whatever deal has been in the works in Amman, is itself very unclear. And then what the ultimate objective of that is, whether it is a sort of, indefinite lower level autonomy in this area, or whether it does have as one of its goals the ultimate reintegration of these areas into the institutions of the Syrian state. If that is the aim, then it's not perfectly obvious to me that there is kind of that the willingness and the interest are there on either side, between the regime and then between many of these areas for whom the re-entrance of the regime may be anathema. The Kurdish areas are interesting just because the project of the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, is deliberately subnational, because it has not aspired to regime change or to the capture of Damascus and the center in Syria. And then because they have, then it seems like some of the institutions, the way that they've organized and set them up, they do seem more purely local, in a way that may not be incompatible with coexistence with or partial reintegration with the Syrian regime and state. They've also had much less access until now to stabilization assistance, which is a lot of what has empowered councils in other areas to provide some of these municipal services and to be more government-like. And so it sounds like the PYD-linked structures may be kind of leaner, more effective, that they've done more with less, which may it may bode well for their stability or for their sustainability. But they also, the challenge that you end up with there is that among international donors, particularly with the United States, it seems like there is willingness to invest in kind of now more limited stabilization programming, the restoration of extremely basic services. The idea is to make these areas, after their capture from ISIS, to make them kind of bare minimum livable, but not hugely comfortable, not to engage in a PYD process of reconstruction or state building or nation building. And so it seems that the risk there is that you end up getting caught in a sort of half-functioning limbo, where you have something that it's not wholly integrated into the state. It can't access the totality of the Syrian state's resources, but its chief international sponsor is unwilling to make it anything more than that. And so you just end up caught in the middle.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. but the if I can, my chapter at least ended up with maybe a larger point or a cruder point, if you want to see it, which is that I think the opportunity for local governance or decentralization and so on, it's not really there in a conflict like Syria, where you have multi-sided wars between different actors, because those wars tend to empower or sort of the only groups that are left standing and that manage to actually implement any sort of governments in the patch of territory that they control, they tend to be the meanest groups of all. And And I think we've seen that with the examples you mentioned there. The most successful governance projects in Syria, except for the Assad regime itself, have been the Islamic State, the PKK, or the groups that they are behind in the Kurdish areas, and then in the territories that some have looked at, Ahrar al-Sham and the Jabhat al-Nusra, or in their subsequent iterations. And in the Ghouta, where I looked, you had the Islam Army, which was also pretty hardline Islamist and intolerant of dissent. And I mean, this is a very systematic. I mean, it's an easy conclusion to make, but it also should inform policy to a greater extent, I think, because if one wants to create something lasting out of a war such as that in Syria or many other places, I think also maybe Yemen and other places, it's important to look at which actors are realistically going to be able to establish something on the ground, and they do that by basically killing off the competition. And those are the actors you're going to have to work with. And that's not a pleasant conclusion to draw, but I think it's true. And it's, political power does grow out of the barrel of a gun. And that's what we've seen in Syria time and time again.
Well, so, go ahead, Sam, sorry.
I could just jump in. I think it also matters which side is going to win.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just because, in areas that the regime has controlled, it seems that there have been repeated efforts to maintain these civilian governance structures that have stood up either in part or in whole. It's okay. And to kind of fold them back into the regime-led Syrian state, and that has always met with rejection, because a key argument for the Assad regime's legitimacy is its unchallenged, singular sovereignty over the entirety of Syria, and then its continued control, its maintenance of basic state functions and services. And what that means is that in these areas that it has retaken, then it has wiped the slate clean. It has eliminated basically all opposition institutions that stood up. It sounds like some individual members may be able to remain behind as kind of their colleagues are deported up to Idlib. So some of them can stay behind and then can rejoin the regime and its institutions in an individual capacity. But the institutions themselves have no future. So we've seen this in the Damascus countryside, and then now we've seen it in East Aleppo, which I think was one of the most dramatic and gruesome instances of this. But there really is, these structures in particular have been yoked to the opposition and to the opposition's political project of regime change, and their survival, apparently, until we see otherwise, their survival hinges on the success or failure of the Syrian opposition.
Yes, all these experiments happen in the context of war and war fighting, or state failure, state shrinkage. There is a vacuum, and yet, the Arab world is the most concentrated region in the world in terms of centralization of authority, and I would argue that centralization of authority has, been one of those drivers that has led to instability in the long run. I guess my question then becomes, if decentralization through the barrel of a gun has not been a particularly productive exercise so far, particularly when those rebel actors are losing, is there capacity for this in a more thoughtful, engaged way? If if we think more long-term about policy and policy prescription, particularly from the outside world, the West, the United States, is subnational governance, is that an area that may be more amenable to reform? I mean, clearly these things are in need of reform, but if we reduce the kind of existential stakes that have kind of dominated the national conversations following the uprisings, where you're talking about constitutional drafting and regime change before that, and clear winners and losers at a kind of national level, is reducing those risks and bringing politics down to a more local level. Do any of you see that as a kind of possibility for the future? And I know you mentioned Iraq, and maybe that's a place to get back to that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in Iraq, I think the future of the polity lies in finding ways for various communities to cohabitate and for the state to create a more inclusive political order. And that involves bottom-up solutions, not just top-down solutions, which is what Iraq has been working on for several years now. There is the cynical side of me when I think about decentralization reforms in certain countries in the region, where they're not necessarily going to yield results. So it really depends on the moment and the context that we're looking at. So yes, decentralization and local governance can be a good way to approach current problems around notions of citizenship, allowing some safety valve for people to express themselves, to be engaged. But how realistic this will be as a political project will depend on the particular context and the moment in which reformers initiate the change. What the experiments that I looked at demonstrate is that once there is an opening, local activists can take advantage, they can deliver results, and they have the potential to learn from their mistakes. Now, some of these activists are not on the ground anymore. They're not allowed, to continue with these experiments in Egypt, obviously because of the current state of the regime. And in Syria, we have the ongoing war and so on. But I think that there is something that shifts at the level of ideas. We've had these post-colonial centralized states in place since the 1950s, and we've had this brief window in which there's a rupture in how governance is being practiced, how state institutions are performing or not performing the roles, and the response has come in very creative and innovative ways. So I'll leave you with these few remarks, perhaps to think about the future, but yeah.
Either of you want to shot at that?
I think across the broader region, I could imagine this being a formula for reform and success. In the Syrian case in particular, I'm relatively pessimistic, in part because just more and more of the country is now being returned to regime control, and then I see no realistic avenues for outsiders to push for reform or any improvements to or under the Assad regime. I don't think it's realistic. I think that discussion of somehow using reconstruction funding or investment as a tool of leverage to extract these sorts of reforms from the regime after years of armed conflict and then the near destruction of the regime itself, the idea that money with strings will somehow accomplish this, I think, is unreal. And so I think that this is, engaging in this with the Assad regime is basically, it's a maze, it's a labyrinth that you go into and then you get lost, you don't find your way out. It's possible to imagine some sort of enforced federalism or devolution of authority in some areas that I think could be more sustainably, plausibly sponsored internationally. So maybe in the Northeast, in these Kurdish areas, but even there, then the political order that has been established is deeply tied up in and entangled with the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization for us and which Turkey is determined to crush. So that is kind of fraught and complicated. It doesn't present an obvious solution. Maybe in Euphrates Shield, North Aleppo, it can be just effectively hived off and then function as an extension of Turkey's Gaziantep province. But even there, I've been told that, when I was last in Ankara, then the Turks told me that they don't want to do that and that they are interested in ultimately reintegrating this area into the Syrian state, just on better, more favorable terms. And then in the south, let's see. I'm reluctant to dismiss this arrangement out of hand just because of the motivated actors that you have in the neighborhood, which I think translates into will on the part of the Americans and the Russians. So I'm interested to see how this plays out. And then in the rest of the country, I basically see no future. So East Ghouta, Northern sorry. East Ghouta, Northern Homs, and then I'm certainly on the pessimistic end of things when it comes to Idlib in the northwest.
Aaron, any thoughts before we turn to the audience?
Yeah, no, I hate to agree, but again, no, really. But I mean, Syria is perhaps a lost cause there because it's so much of a military contest between groups and governments that they're fighting precisely not to share power, and that's how it's going to end up. I think they might share territory out of sheer necessity, but they will never share power. That's the whole point of it. As for areas where you do not have a civil war, and where you would be more perhaps easier to implement things like this and have a political, peaceful evolution toward these things, yes, and I hope so. But I'm obviously the countries of the Arab world are very different and in very different situations, and I don't think there's one solution would fit all. There's probably countries where that would be a destabilizing thing as well. So I'm going to let this go, but just one comment on Sam here. I think what we might see in Syria with the regime, and in terms of decentralization or local governance or local influence, it's not going to be institutional. But what I do think that what we might see is power shifting within the system controlled by Assad to other sectors of the regime or other regions of the regime where the regime is strong and so on, and drawing on other, well, whatever it might be, families or groups or individuals, and this kind of informal politics. I think in the context of a country like Syria, or regime-held Syria, I think one often makes the mistake of staring at the institutions and seeing how can we reform these things when in fact power is located elsewhere, and there might be changes, and it's just that they're very hard for us to spot. So,
Great. So
yeah.
we'll turn to you guys, and same format. Microphone will go around, and we'll take maybe 3 at a time to speed things up. Okay, so we'll start here in the front row.
Hi. First, I want to thank all of you, particularly Asya, for talking about the creativity that comes from when you actually have the space to do this. You know, when people, activists, the population get a chance to actually run their communities and to be engaged in them. And I know even in areas in Syria where, you know, there's been a lot of creativity and there's still a little pushback on armed groups. And I think maybe thinking more about, you know, whether it's pushback in places like Atarib where they've pushed them out of the city limits, and I'm sure other areas in Idlib where it's not a uniform, you know, just a uniform battle between different groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, but there's also local actors that are able to do something. I wonder if you could maybe, you know, is there a way to draw that out more, or is it simply irrelevant? You know, I mean, maybe now it's not as in the stage where we've reached, maybe there's nothing local citizens can do or local communities can do to push back, but where have we seen, or can you maybe draw out some of those examples where the local community has been able to shape some of this governance? And my other, and I won't ask another question.
Dr. Asya, one of the things you were talking about is in Egypt, the decentralization experiences or models. Did you see anything that between the period where Islamists and the Brotherhood was in control of the country in Egypt, were they accepted by the communities in which they were in the different villages and in the different communities of Egypt? And after the fall of Morsi, what happened to these communities where the Brotherhood was in control of these municipality councils? As for the Syrian side, I would like to ask, in your research, how much did you go in depth into knowing the conflict, let's say at the end of this tragic conflict, between the Alawis and the Sunnis, because it boils down now to the mistrust between the two communities. And the question of Idlib versus Jabal al-Nusayri and the Levant part of Syria, this is something that is going to be a big issue in the coming negotiations between whoever is going to really control the Syrian state, because the question boils down, unfortunately, to the mistrust that today we have between the two communities.
So, first of all, just to hark back to what Thanassis said in the first panel, that states exert a huge amount of capital and effort to make sure that these experiments don't work. And I just feel like it's worth commenting that, you know, overshadowing this extremely pessimistic panel is the fact that the Syrian government's very deliberate, explicit, and ruthless strategy was to make sure that not one of these local governance experiments could work, and that civilian experiments were quickly overtaken by military warlordism or war economies. But that said, when Asya mentioned the Lijan Shabiya, I always get startled by that comment, by that term, as someone who's focused more on Syria, because in Syria, that was the name, the first name of the pro-government militias, which of course were far less spontaneous than the ones in Egypt, and later developed into the National Defense Force and other iterations that ended up being largely controlled by Iran and others. But that comes to Aaron's last point, which I really would like you guys to go into more. Those are also, in a way, decentralizing power centers, and they and their analogs around Syria, the decentralization of government power and the disintegration of government power, its replacement by other types of power, which always existed but have become much more assertive and in many cases have actually erased government power. And I keep hearing from groups within the regime that the regime is going to owe us at the end, and they cannot continue to monopolize power by a few families, and that the real change in Syria, if it ever happens, might come from demanding a different piece of the pie or more say from those that helped win the war. And have you looked into that or seen any possibilities there?
Great. So Aaron, why don't you start us off and take whichever ones of those you'd like to
Sorry,
address.
at the last one there.
No, we'll do the next one.
All right. Yeah. Well, very good question. I think it is a very good question and a very difficult question, because no one really knows how the Syrian regime works from the inside. I mean, I guess Bashar al-Assad has a good idea, but I'm not even sure that he has the sort of the full vision of the whole sort of sprawling web of institutions and militias and personal connections. And I think it's absolutely true that the regime, and especially the security forces, have since 2011, they've transformed in many ways. And the growth of local militias has been the most visible effect. And of course, the arrival of foreign militias and groups from Hezbollah to other groups. I don't necessarily, I mean, obviously that is a kind of decentralization, but I think also much of it is, I mean, part of it is more sort of the iceberg was always there, but now it's a bit more over the water, I think. I mean, the Syrian security apparatus, not the army so much, but the security services were always kind of a divided and deliberately divided structure, sometimes tangled and sometimes held very separately before the war. And these security services that mostly operated in the shadows before the war have now come out in the open and are active fighting formations. And that's many of the militias that we're now seeing that we think, oh, that's the army that is broken to pieces. No, that's the security web that's surfacing. And so I'm not really sure that has, I mean, it's a different thing than before the war, certainly, but it's not necessarily a lessening of central control. Yeah, and it's very difficult to tell, of course, and there you do have sort of skirmishing between these militias, for example. Not on the level that you have in the opposition territories where there's actual fighting, because they all go back to Assad in some way, and when needed, he's sort of still able to send an order that pulsates out slowly through the whole web of institutions and then ends up and gets implemented, more or less. But I think the regime is not necessarily getting more divided, it's getting more dysfunctional. And if something were to happen at the center of the regime, where all these threads come together, whether it's Assad personally or sort of the wider web of close advisors and top security chiefs that are around him, then I think you might see division very fast and things unspooling quickly. But again, this is all speculation because who knows?
Space for pro-regime civilians
All right, sorry.
Pissed off about
Right.
the lack of governance, lack of security, lack of everything.
Right.
To get heard?
Good question again, and also something that I've heard raised from both pro-opposition people and pro-government people actually. I mean, we'll see after the war, right? But the thing is, I'm not sure there is an after the war, because the way the Syrian conflict is moving, you're seeing less, not seeing less fighting, but you see a future where there could be less fighting. As Assad has recaptured most of what what he needs, and he's negotiating with the Kurds or with the Americans or whatever. But I think the formal state of war will last a very long time, and if it doesn't last a very long time, the regime will make sure that it does. The same way that the state of emergency was motivated by war with Israel since 1962. So. I'm sure there will be, as I said in that comment to Sam as well, I'm sure there will be changes and sort of a rebalancing of internal relations inside the regime, and this officer and his family will suddenly become much richer, and this family will drop down. But those are things that I think are mostly unknowable, at least to me. And I'm sure it's happening. But as for like a wider segment of pro-loyalist civilians or civilians who are still in Syria protesting and getting what they want, I think they might protest, but they will not get what they want. We've seen that in 2011, unfortunately. But I mean, there has been a kind of as ruthless and authoritarian as the Syrian security apparatus is, I think there has been a kind of there are more margins for expressing dissent, or at least there's less policing of dissent if it does not touch upon any of the issues that are relevant to the war. I mean, you can complain about the economy in ways you couldn't do before. That's maybe less because the regime has decided this is the way it should be, and more because it has other things on its mind, and there's now Facebook. So, things will change, but how, I wouldn't dare guess,
Sam?
Sure, so on Salma's question, I mean, certainly again, with the caveat that I have an incomplete picture on this, yeah, I mean, it is my sense that there is kind of a continuing presence for independent civil society in these areas. Many, not all, but in towns like El-Atarab or Saraqib, Marat al-Nu'man, then there is still a vibrant and independent civil society that may in some instances push back on armed groups, or at a minimum just exist apart from them, which is itself sort of a win. I do also think, though, that, I mean, when it does come to the point of a confrontation, when things do come to a head, then the armed groups win. And that it's typically in the north, it's Nusra that wins, because the other armed groups, some of which may provide kind of moral support to these to civil society actors, they're not coherent or unified. They don't mount a collective defense, and so Nusra can just mobilize some guys out of the Badia and then pick people off individually as needed. So I think that this kind of soft power and authority is real, but it has limits. I also don't know, I think that there's a tendency among some people to conflate civil society with the local councils, which, and then to present the local councils themselves as kind of a counter-extremist actor or a rival for power in these areas, which is not the impression that I've gotten from talking to people. The sense that I've gotten, which again, may be flawed, imperfect, is that the councils themselves tend to be largely apolitical and service-focused. To some extent, they do, to some extent, have a political character in that, you know, they do represent participatory politics. They exist in defiance of the Assad regime, but they're not a real kind of rival political power center in that sense, and in the sense that I think some people have portrayed them as. On sectarianism, I mean, I think that I assume that this is going to be a continued challenge. I know that there's some work underway to achieve real reconciliation, kind of lateral reconciliation between communities on the ground inside Syria, and then not the like musalahat, not the reconciliations as the regime has promoted it. But I don't know, I honestly don't know what to expect in terms of the prospects for that. I think that, I assume that there's going to be a lot of ill feeling for a long time. And then, which I'm sure will feed into future bouts of instability and civil conflict. And then on decentralization under the regime, so at least what I have heard is that in terms of the formal institutions, there has been very little effective decentralization of power. That there may be some authorities that have devolved to the muhafazat, the provincial level, but not really to the local level. And so that seems to be the direction of at least the formal institutions of the state. Certainly, though, I buy that you might have devolution of effective power down to kind of elements of the informal apparatus, these networks that collectively comprise the regime. But in those instances, I think it seems likely that the actors that are empowered are frequently going to be the worst, most predatory ones.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so the question was on what happened to the committees, the local committees, with the accession of Morsi to power, or even before that, with the parliamentary elections and the winning of the Muslim Brothers of parliament. The Lajnah Sha'biyya always had a tense relationship with with what remained of the state and with SCAF, but with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, you had the introduction of another dynamic, which is competition over claiming some of the successes and wins for the community. So if a medical clinic was constructed, for instance, or the local activists had succeeded in providing a certain service, now activists who are connected to the Muslim Brothers were coming and putting banners, for instance, on the medical clinic, or claiming that this is their work, not the local popular committee's work. So there was a great deal of tension that resulted from this attempt of the Muslim Brothers to exert more control at the local level. You also had the fact that there were deep shortages in services, not just in electricity, but also access to, waste collection, all kinds of services across Greater Cairo and particularly in informal areas. And it coincided with concerns about the deliberate targeting of those constituencies that are more supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. So what started to happen is that increasingly people got alienated from the Morsi regime because they saw the local actors who are manipulating access to services and tying it to voting records and so on. So at a very micro level, clearly there was a process whereby that regime was gradually losing support.
So let me take two quick questions to end it here since we're about to run out of time, but let's start here in the front row.
Thank you very much. I always thought about Syria and Egypt, Syria as ideological conflicts and Egypt political conflicts, and so it might be easier to solve the second one, but not the first one. But we have something not in this context. We have something like dictatorship, and we had in the Arab regions we still have prime minister since 1971. We have one prime minister in Bahrain, just an example. And unless we see the Western changing their strategy in this area, which we always think about this since say 40 or 45 years, without getting the West American, European involved in these countries, like what happened in Egypt when the American, they stopped talking to Mubarak at that time, then the revolution happened. Or what happened to Saddam Hussein, the big change in Iraq and in this area. What's happening in Syria is different. And what's happening in the GCC, which we think it's always need kind of strategic decisions from the Western, since because they are still thinking there's still money in this areas. Trump is coming to Saudi Arabia, so we had two elephants in one room, not one elephant. This is what I think always. Billions and billions being paid to the Western, so they are still supporting dictatorships in terms of reality. It's not what the Western is saying. Like when I've heard what Obama said during the interview with the Friedman about these countries. We are willing to protect them from outside, but they have to protect themselves from the inside. So I don't know what you think about this idea. Thank you.
Question, right?
When we talk about local governance in Syria, I was wondering how many of the opposition groups do actually have a local governance agenda, like put this as one of their top priorities. You mentioned that for FSA-affiliated groups, it was seen as part of the broader approach to integrate that into a free Syria ruled idea. But for example, for Ahrar Sham and Nusra, do you really see that they want to have local governance, or is territorial control rather a means of securing more resources, access to manpower, and stuff that would actually help them in fighting rather than local governance goals? Thank you.
We'll stop there and turn it back to the panel. And since we're about over time here, we'll hopefully keep it brief, and this will serve as our kind of concluding remarks.
Super brief answer to the last question. And then I don't see that those are opposing. I mean, you can do both, no? You can want to govern a territory and leave that to people from that territory and still exploit it for money and power and territory. I don't necessarily see them as opposed. I'm sure that differs from many different groups and so on. Even Ahrar al-Sham is such a diverse movement. So I'm sure you have a group in a village in Idlib that is super focused on controlling that village, and the leadership might have very different priorities, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd second that. I don't know if it necessarily makes sense to ascribe too much coherence and strategy to a lot of this. I mean, in part because of the sort of leaderless, overlapping structures of the Syrian opposition, in which both kind of armed and civilian actors have periodically have kind of joined together or have competed for authority. I don't think that there's like a single FSA master plan here, or that even the FSA is not even a single thing, really. To the extent that anyone, that I've seen anyone have a really, what looked like a developed idea, then in my research it was Ahrar. They had a concept that it seemed relatively sophisticated. I actually thought that it would be much more successful than it was, and then it wasn't. Because they just ran up at the edge, they ran up against the edges of their own, geographic zones of control, their own resources, kind of the limits of the administrative, technical cadres that they had on hand, and then they were frustrated, like it seems almost everyone else was. And then that was just kind of the atmospheric reality of this.
And if I may just add, on the local administrative councils that I did interviews on, another dynamic is that of donors, so donor priorities as well, and how dependent they were on donors, and the particular moment that, if donors are going to push for greater involvement of local governance issues over other things, that also seems to matter. But there was also some keenness among those activists to frame their work within the formal legal institutional framework of Syria. So even though they were clearly, in the opposition to the Assad regime, and they are in the process of constructing something different, they wanted to structure, these local councils in ways that look consistent with, the former legal structures of Syria. So how far does that allow for serious kind of continuation of bottom-up governance or not, and how serious are they? Can they afford it? All of these are kind of questions hanging in the balance, I'd say. Yeah.
So I'll address your question just so we don't leave it hanging, but I think the case study of Mubarak in Egypt tells us a lot about what the United States will do and what it can do. Mubarak didn't fall because of decisions made in Washington. He fell because of what happened in Egypt. I think the Americans might have eased that process along, but I think the lesson out of that, particularly now in sort of post-uprising, this kind of post-uprisings reactionary era, is that the United States is not going to leapfrog the kind of organic, dynamic, local forces that exist. And if those forces don't exist within those countries or more broadly within the region, the United States is not going to be the kind of progenitor and engine for that kind of political change. And until there is a kind of critical mass for that within any of these countries, and I think personally Egypt is maybe at least a decade off before we have a process of real political regeneration, the United States is not, when there is so little capacity or hope for real fundamental change, the United States at this moment is not going to be the party that enters into that fray and is the one that's going to be pushing for very serious overarching political change. So thank you. I will end on that depressing note. I really appreciate everybody coming out and sticking with us for both of these panels. And I just note that we have a second volume in this series, very different volume on regional security dialogue and regional security architecture and its future at a time of conflict. And that is scheduled to be coming out in March of 2018. So thanks again. So Maha is signaling that, yes, we have a small reception for whoever wants to stick around after and continue the conversation. So right outside.